So as I say, we kicked off formally in July 2020. To be fair, we were kind of engaging and talking before that. And then in April of this year, we launched a work plan. And in May, which was a really great moment, the CMA and the ICO came out and jointly published a statement on competition and privacy, which was our first kind of setting out in the public domain some of these interactions and how we work together, which my ICO and CMA colleagues will come on to talk about later. As we look to next year, we'll be thinking about our next work plan, but also reporting on the work that we're doing to date and how we're kind of really transparent to industry and to users about what we're doing with this forum. So I'm going to say a little bit more on the next slide about precisely what we're trying to do in response to those two challenges I set out. So there's a few things. As ever, there's always quite a lot to do. We see this as an opportunity to really innovate and think about how we're using our tools together across the space. It's about, first and foremost, coherence. So as I say, as you think about both our existing regimes, but then also new things coming down the track, it's clear that you can't kind of, you can't stay in one regulatory remit without thinking about what's on either side and how those interactions might play out. And it's all really about how they might play out for users and for industry. You know, it's not about how does it make it easier for us, though frankly it should, but it's about really actually how do we make this coherent for people who are using these services day to day, but also for industry. Secondly, it's about coordination. So as we see big tech and market developments and changes in consumer behavior, how can we work together to respond to them more effectively? And how can we help each other through that process, which leads on to the third part, which is about resources and skills. And, you know, how can we ensure that we are each building the skills we need to respond effectively to these challenges, but also how can we be more effective together in doing that? Day to day, this means we're exploring emerging policy challenges in the digital space. As I say, we're developing the skills that we need. We're also thinking about how we anticipate future developments. You know, we all have various forms of horizon scanning programs. Actually, how can we think about some of the linkages between those and how we might be more coherent in that space? Promoting innovation is really key, as I've already said. And then also thinking about how we engage with other regulators outside of this forum. So obviously there are 4 of us, and there's lots of other people interested in this space and working on related issues. And then also how we engage internationally. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Sarah? So, as I say, in March, April this year, we published the work plan for the year, and it was, you know, we'd set out kind of our statement of purpose, if you like, when we first launched about what we wanted the DRCF to be, but we wanted to be really, really transparent with people about what we were seeking to do, and it was across 4 main areas. So, firstly, this point I've talked about responding strategically to industry and technology. There's 4 projects set out here, and they're all in kind of different phases of development, but essentially looking at cross-cutting issues. How is it, you know, if we're all thinking about the impact of algorithmic processing in our regulatory areas, actually, isn't it helpful for industry if we are thinking about actually how do our approaches relate? Are they the same? Are they different? What are the differences? Are there reasons for that? And so, you know, firms that need to engage with us are not engaging in just 4 different perspectives, but we have kind of done a bit of the pre-thinking about how those come together and where we might be saying the same or different things. And it's not always the same thing. It's not always appropriate for 4 different regulators with 4 different objectives to come to the same conclusion, but at least we've thought about where the similarities or differences are. The second area, so that's the kind of big strategic piece. And, you know, say those areas we're focused on the moment, new things always coming up and we're thinking about how we want to respond to them. The second piece is more at the level of the individual regulatory regimes and how do we think about the interactions. I already mentioned the really important piece of joint work on competition and privacy, which, as I say, colleagues will come to speak about later. Another one I would mention here is that it's become very clear that there are significant interactions when we think about the safety of people online between the approaches we're taking in Ofcom, as we're already implementing the regime to regulate video sharing platforms, but also as we think about the future regulation regulatory regime for online safety, and the work the ICO has been doing on the age-appropriate design code. And how do we think about the protection of children across those two regimes, and how do we come together to be more effective in that pursuit? Thirdly, there's this really important piece that I've already mentioned about building skills and capabilities, knowledge in key areas, but also skills. How do we build them each that we need to kind of make the decisions we need to, but also how can we be more effective as a group in doing that? And then finally, this really, really important piece around engagement. You know, we see this as really core to the work that all four of us are doing, but we also recognise there's significant interactions for other regulators. Of course, you know, these players in the digital space, a lot of them are global firms. So thinking about actually how we engage internationally, which again, each of us does. But how can we think about it across the four of us to make that even more important? And how can we engage with industry? And that's why it's really brilliant to be here today, to engage with all of you. It's a really broad, diverse audience, which is great. And we'd love to hear from you and kind of have a bit of interaction on some of these questions. I think first I'm handing back to Stuart.
Lovely. Thank you, Kate. Now, in time-honoured fashion, I've got a few prepared questions, but would really love any questions from the audience, so you can pop them down in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to get to them before the end of the session. So one of the questions I like to bring up first, and obviously I think one of the things that will come up on a regular basis will be about the membership of the forum and its powers. So I'm going to pass this over to Kate Collier from the FCA, and and how should businesses see the DRCF and how can they engage with it? And Kate, would you mind just sort of spending sort of 20 seconds or explaining your role at the FCA as well, so people know your remit there?
Thank you, Stuart. And let me start by saying thank you for inviting us all today. I think we all really welcome the opportunity to be part of this conversation with you all. My name is Kate Collier. I am Director of Competition and Chief Economist at the Financial Conduct Authority. So I take the lead in our engagement in the Digital Regulatory Cooperation Forum. Thank you for your question. I think it's a really important one, and perhaps I can pick up on some of the points that Kate was making about the work of the DRCF and our objectives, how that fits with our individual objectives, and how we see that working in terms of engagement for members and business. So the DRCF work reflects each of the regulators' existing functions, and that includes the commitments that we each have to transparency and to consultation, which is something we each take seriously. So through the work of the DRCF, we've been, throughout that work, we've been welcoming views, we've been engaging quite actively. So when we published our work plan and whenever we've done public work, we've been looking to get input and engagement from the public and from business, and we are really keen to ensure that that continues as we develop out our work stream specific areas, and we're actively seeking input and engagement on each of those. One of the main things we want to achieve through the DRCF is to ensure that we join things up. You can see you've got representatives from each of the four regulators here today, and that is a conscious effort for us to join things up and avoid duplicating efforts. So part of that is about how we do the stakeholder engagement as well. So you'll see, for example, there'll be efforts between the four of us to engage stakeholders together. And so one example of that is the joint work between Ofcom and the CMA, which was on platforms and publishers, and where both organisations met with stakeholders together. Another good example is the work that we're doing around algorithms, and that's an important area for us, and where we are seeking to avoid going at these important questions separately, but looking to actually come together to try and understand the issues as a group. So we will be focusing and continuing to be open with stakeholders and looking wherever we can for opportunities to get input from business and the public. So whether that's on specific issues or topics, or just more generally about the DRCF. So we very much welcome all of the engagement that we have.
Yes, thank you, Kate. And just following up from that, and it's great to see all that cooperation and across the agencies. But do you feel that, and I'm going to put this to Will from the CMA, do you feel that businesses may be concerned about the growing number of different digital regimes and who's responsible for what across each one, and is this something that DRCF is considering about how to engage further with businesses to sort of reduce some of those concerns? And Will, again, if you could sort of tell the audience just a sort of brief snippet about what your role is at the CMA.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart. And again, thanks for having me and all of us here. So my name is Will Hayter. I'm Senior Director for the Shadow Digital Markets Unit at the Competition and Markets Authority. So this is one of the elements of changes in frameworks that's happening at the moment. The government's currently, well, actually the consultation closes today for the creation of a new pro-competition digital markets framework, and the digital markets unit within the CMA is here to implement that as and when that is put into place fully. So I mean, this question goes to a really important aspect of the forum, actually. So it's great to be able to get into this. As we've heard, there's lots going on in each of our individual areas, whether it's online safety or the digital markets framework or the data reform consultation. I would say it's important to note that these are all government-led bits of work and are all subject to Parliament's eventual decision-making, but we're here to help and to advise, and then of course to implement the results. But in our four organisations, you've got lots of experience in devising and implementing smart forms of regulation, and also lots of experience trying to work out how to tailor that regulation to different sizes and types of firm. So particularly then in this phase of new policy development and new legislation, it's especially important that we work together and share that experience, try and work out what the touch points are between these different overall objectives, and try and make sure they can work together seamlessly and appear seamless to businesses engaging with them. So I mean, there are some examples which I'll mention briefly, and I'm sure we'll come back to. One is the online safety bill, where several of us have worked together, and then also with government to help make sure that's in the best possible shape. There's also the work that we've done with the ICO on the interaction between competition and data protection. So that's a joint statement that we issued back in May, showing, for example, in this case, that robust data protection and vibrant competition can support one another, and then indeed stating that firms shouldn't use data protection to shore up their competitive positions. So those are just a couple of examples of how we can and are working increasingly closely together to help make sure these pieces of work are complementary. Kate Collier also mentioned the platforms and publishers work, which we've been doing with Ofcom, which was a request from the Secretary of State for DCMS back in April for us to look at how a digital markets code of conduct might affect the relationship between publishers or content producers, particularly news publishers, and the biggest platforms. And that's been working really well. The wonders of video working mean we can form these virtual teams across organizations much more easily than we ever could before, actually. So another good example. And also on horizon scanning, Kate Davis touched on this, really important there that we, as well as doing our own individual work, that we pool our thoughts and compare notes. I mean, in terms of how businesses can engage, we're very keen, as others have said already, to make this a discussion and a dialogue, and whether that's with each individual member, all of our doors are respectively open on the particular areas that we work on. But also there's a DRCF contact point. You can email drcf@ofcom.org.uk, and I'm sure someone will chuck that in the chat, please. So feel free to open up a conversation with us as DRCF if there are things that you as a business feel need addressing across two or more of our respective frameworks.
That's lovely. Thank you, Will. Now I've got a question for Stephen now from the ICO, and it's and the question I had prepared sort of links in with one of the questions that's just come into the chat. It's about there have been calls for a single digital regulator, and how does the DRCF see this proposal? And someone in the chat has talked about a structure similar to the DRCF will be unnecessary in France because the French Competition Authority and the Data Protection Authority already work together formally. So it'd be interesting to see why you've chosen this route of cooperation rather than government choosing one single regulator.
Technology. Hi everybody, I'm Stephen Almond. I'm Director of Technology and Innovation at the Information Commissioner's Office, the data protection regulator. And I suppose turning to the question, so I don't need to tell this audience that we have gathered here today that digital technologies are transforming every sector of the economy. They're creating new ideas, products, business models, different ways of working. And so for what it's worth, I don't think the answer is to create a single mega regulator, because actually what we need to be thinking about is the underlying issues here, the issues of, for example, online safety, of fair competition, of appropriate sort of data protections, for example. And that requires us to not try and merge it all into one, but to think quite carefully about how can we work together? How do we cooperate to pool our expertise? How do we get the right join up between a horizontal cross-cutting regime like data protection that affects lots of firms and the financial services regime, which is deliberately structured around a particular sector? So what we've really focused on is bringing us together in a way that enables us to pool our expertise and our thinking and deal with things jointly rather than separately. But that requires us, frankly, to find new connections and work together on a very agile way as new issues come across. The connections that we have that will be appropriate for one area will need to be different for another area of policy that emerges. So it's really important, actually, in my view, that we have agile cooperative structures that are able to respond to the rapid change that we see in the digital economy and the novel challenges that are posed, without framing that around a sort of a rigid structure or a kind of an overburdened and beast of a regulator that would struggle to respond to those sorts of challenges. So I think, I can say we're pretty confident that the DRCF is the right answer in terms of providing that mechanism for collaboration on issues that cut across the digital landscape and require a joint approach from us.
That's great. No, I can fully see that and saying the specialisation in each of the areas, which I think that's I can understand why you're going down that route. And so in terms of looking at and particularly Kate, in your presentation earlier, talked about different objectives and different frameworks and interactions, because it's obviously a very complex area across the whole of government, as Stephen just said. And Kate, you mentioned about the DRCF is working on those interactions between those different frameworks. And could you give us some sort of examples of that work in practice? Because I know this is the plan of working together, but what have you done in practice and is making some concrete changes already? Yeah.
Thank you, Stuart, and apologies because I failed to introduce myself. But I'm Kate Davis, Director of Public Policy at Ofcom. So yeah, this point around interactions is absolutely one of the core reasons why we created the DRCF. Will and Stephen, I think, are best placed to talk about the joint work on competition and privacy with the statement that they published, which also linked to the work on the Google Privacy Sandbox. And that is something, it's a really, really important step forward this year. Thinking about Ofcom's remit, there's a few examples that I draw out that are related. So I already mentioned that there's a significant interaction as we think about the ICO's work on the age-appropriate design code and Ofcom's work on the regulation of video sharing platforms. Both regimes are in large part, though the video sharing platform has some broader areas, but both regimes are in large part focused on the protection of children. And there's a really, really clear interaction there. Age assurance is a key element of both. And so we're working out to figure out what that means and really ensure that we can provide clarity to industry, but also to users, to parents, to ensure they know who to come to and when and how and why. And there's similar questions when we think about the online safety regime that's obviously still under development. But in that regime, we will need to consider privacy alongside other key areas such as freedom of expression and how you balance these priorities when you're thinking about protecting people and making them safer online. And yeah, it's we would have already been engaging with the ICO, but the DRCF has just really strengthened that. And means that we're really progressing joint work together in these areas rather than kind of working in parallel, which sometimes has been known to happen. I think that's all I'll say on that one.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Kate. And I'm just going to go back to Will for a second. And Kate, you just mentioned it there as well about the joint statement from the ICO and the CMA. Could you expand on that a little bit more and the impact that's having of how you're working together as two of the agencies within the forum?
Yeah, thank you. Very glad to. We're really pleased with that statement and the work that went into it. We think it's a global first for such a statement to come jointly from a competition authority and a data protection regulator. There can be or has been sometimes a bit of a narrative to suggest that data protection and competition are at odds in some way, and actually in doing the work we were able to be very clear that actually they can work together very, very strongly. So there are a few points in there that are worth mentioning. Firstly, just the important, although perhaps a bit obvious point, that data, particularly personal data, has such vital importance in the digital economy. A broad point about the strong synergies that exist between the aims of competition and data protection, essentially to say that in order to ensure strong data protection and also to ensure strong competition, you really need consumers, people, to be able to take informed decisions about how they're engaging with markets online, and that applies across the both. We covered a few ways that we would work together to overcome any perceived tensions between the two sets of objectives, and there are some practical examples in there on how we've been working together. And I'll just highlight one of those in particular. One of the effects of the UK's exit from the EU has resulted in essentially a bigger area of responsibility in terms of some of these global businesses for both our organisations. And a good example of that is the work that we're currently doing on our investigation into Google's so-called privacy sandbox, which is its stated intention to remove third-party cookies from Chrome. So we opened a formal competition investigation at the beginning of this year into that proposal, and that's going on at the moment. We've been consulting on some commitments from Google to change the way it's going to be making this amendment to its business practices. But it's a really good example because we've been using the combined work of the CMA and the ICO throughout that case to make sure that when we are pursuing the objective of protecting competition, we don't inadvertently cause an issue with data protection. So I think it's a really nice example, which will hopefully get to a good result that supports both competition and strong data protection.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Will. And just going to flip between a question I have and one from the chat, and it's about the online harms regulation. And I know a few of you have mentioned that. And you know, up in Leeds, we've got a strong safety tech industry, and you may see behind one of our key sponsors is Chris, but I know he's been engaging with the UK government over the last few years and contributing to the whole online harms piece. And And it may be a question, I'll put it to Stephen to start with, but you know, what are the responsibilities, but particularly for Ofcom and the ICO, and the responsibilities to protect minors online, and how are you working with the industry, the safety tech industry, who can obviously be a big part of the solution to this, you know, incredibly important challenge of making sure that, you know, that particular minors can't access inappropriate material.
Look, thank you, you know, for focusing the conversation on children's safety online, which is such an important issue for us as a regulator, but for Ofcom as a regulator. In the ICO, we have set out our age-appropriate design code, which came into force just last month, which is about ensuring that where services are likely to be accessed by kids, that their rights are respected when their data is used, and that really data protection is built in by design into their services, and that's been a real milestone piece of work for us, and we've seen a raft of changes of behaviour in the response to that from the online platforms. And in parallel, Ofcom has been acquiring duties to regulate video sharing platforms, and that is all about, in many respects, a connected set of harms. It's about, well, as Kate noted, it runs broader. That, you know, it requires video sharing platforms to have in place protection measures to protect minors from material that might have effectively an impact on their development, and so it's critical that as we both progress with these regulatory regimes that have real synergies in their aims, that we are working together. I think this is probably one of my favourite areas of collaboration between us as regulators through the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, because this is an area where I think we're making our collaboration really real. These are both new regimes that are coming into force, where we are not just sort of developing high level, nice policy pieces that say, oh yes, we're all working together, you know, aren't we great? But actually we're thinking really practically about how we are going to work together so that we are able to exchange information where permitted, you know, and kind of necessary by law, that we are able to understand each other's approaches to monitoring, supervision, enforcement of these regimes, and that we're able to engage in a way that jointly maximises our impact with industry and makes consumers aware of kind of the potential of these regimes. And so it's going to be by working together in this area that we're going to have the greatest impact, actually, in terms of improving children's safety online. We could do this in parallel, and we could have our own sort of separate impacts in this, but actually it's going to be by working together that we're going to have the greatest possible impact, and we're going to bring our collective might to the table on this. And I think that's a really exciting area for us to focus on. But I should pass to my colleague Kate.
Thank you. And I'm, you know, to touch on some of the questions raised in relation to this in the chat, you know, I think it's also really important to recognise that kind of we're working together, but also we bring in kind of thinking around other areas. So, for example, the interaction with, you know, competition and innovation, obviously working with the CMA, but how we think about how does it work to kind of ensure you can protect children online, whilst also ensuring that there is a, you know, that doesn't mean that certain platforms gain dominance because they, you know, they also have the technology, and how do those kind of different objectives interact? It's something that a lot of us are used to doing kind of on our own, thinking about the interaction between different objectives, particularly with the sectoral regulators. But this is a really great space to think about them together and think, actually, how does that work? You know, the privacy and competition example is a great one, but I think the same sort of plays out in this space, actually. You know, and I think the approach we're taking on VSPs and with the age appropriate design code, similarly, you know, it's a risk-based approach at heart, and it's for platforms and for industry more generally to kind of own the technological solutions. And I think that's really key to the question of how you kind of promote innovation and avoid a situation where regulators are setting up a system that has some kind of unintended outcomes when it comes to, as I say, those other elements like innovation and competition.
Thank you. And just to merge a couple of questions from the chat, and I'll throw this open to anyone who wants to pick it up. You know, how does the forum and government in general work with those smaller tech firms that may not have the resources to bring in some of the bring in some of the best practice that the government and the forum would like them to have, or is it just going to be left to the huge tech giants to actually make sure that age verification and many other things are brought in? How do we make sure that homegrown smaller industries, companies have a role to play in this new world of digital regulation? Yeah.
I might pick that one up if I may. So there's for several of us, there's a real focus on how we work with innovative emerging market players and help them to understand our regulatory frameworks and help them to bring new ideas, products, services to market. And this is actually an area where I'd really like to touch on a long-running area of collaboration between the ICO and the FCA in this area. And now the FCA is, I think, it's appropriate to say, kind of world famous for its regulatory sandbox and its various innovation initiatives enabling the stimulation of sort of financial services products that that better serve the interests of consumers. And the ICO has, in parallel, operated its own set of schemes around its own regulatory sandbox and its own sort of advice services to innovators. And we could do that stuff separately and say, you've got a data protection question, go and talk to those people at the ICO. But actually, we forged a really collaborative relationship with our partners at the FCA, and behind the scenes, the join up kind of gets done around that. Another area where I suppose that I'd just like to draw out just from our sort of formal collaboration through the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum is our work on thinking about design frameworks. Now, for those of you who I suppose aren't in the know, you may think, oh, that sounds like a particularly nerdy term, but actually the importance of getting the design right up front in order to take on board the objectives of regulation is so important. If you don't build in the regulatory objectives around safety, around data protection, around fairness by default into the design, you end up trying to retrofit things at great sort of cost and complexity afterwards. And we're actually working really closely behind the scenes right now to think, how do we join those initiatives that we have ourselves sort of put together? So, for example, we have a design framework that's intended to support designers around children's safety. How do we join that up with the pieces that each of our 4 regulators is putting together to help designers design services, I suppose, right first time? And I really hope that is an initiative that will make it easier for people who are looking to enter markets, looking to try and sort of break through, to actually comply and engage across all of our different regulatory regimes jointly.
No, that's great, thank you. And there's just a quick follow-up that and if anyone else wants to pick up on this, how can people within the industry, whether it's somebody with a new idea or one of the more established companies, how can they get more engaged with the forum? Are you having regular sort of public meetings to bring people in, or how do you want them to approach you? Because it's a complex issue, and as you say, it's much better for people to have that engagement really early instead of having to backfit it later on. Yeah.
Thanks, Stuart. I mean, I'll come in briefly on that one. So look, we love to engage in, not just industry, but I noticed earlier there was a question about civil society, etc. you know, the emails in the chat, we're still working on kind of how we engage. Obviously, each of us individually engages right across society and industry. And what we don't want to do is create, you know, there's 4 of us and then create a 5th sort of place where you've got to come and kind of make your points or raise questions. I think if you do have questions and you're not sure who it comes to, then the DRCF is a good place to start. And then more generally, we're just thinking about how we can engage. And as I say, you know, if people have thoughts of how they'd like to do that, please do let us know. I'll just pick up very briefly while I'm talking on the latest question, where I just think it's worth just being really clear. And I noticed, Christoph, you had a question earlier on. Well, first, I want to say we're not saying the DRCF is the best framework. We're saying it's the one we're going with to really try and make some practical change on a non-statutory basis. So this, you know, whilst we call it formal, you know, because we have set it up, we've launched it, we have a work plan, we want to be accountable and transparent. You know, each of the regulators has a statutory basis and powers and duties. The forum does not have that status. So we are doing this voluntarily because we think it's the right thing to do to make change now. And that speaks to some of the questions you just raised, Christoph, that, you know, the forum can't enforce or take decisions. It's just a mechanism to bring us together to really ensure that we are making that step change in cooperation and collaboration.
That's great. Thank you, Kate. Now, when I mentioned to someone the other day that I was chairing this, they just asked me about 20 questions about AI and the regulation of artificial intelligence, and I'm going to pass this over to Kate Collier now. And you know, a general question about the regulation of AI, and do the existing regulatory frameworks, do they provide sufficient coverage, or is it something you're going to give a lot of attention to within the forum?
Thanks, Stuart. It's an excellent question and a hot topic, obviously, at the moment. I'm sure everyone's seen the government published the National Strategy for AI, I think, a couple of weeks ago. And ultimately, I mean, it is for government to decide whether the regulatory framework is in the right place when it comes to AI. Speaking just about financial services for a moment, our belief is that the current standards are sufficient, but we are also, as a group, looking at AI, and in particular, one of the things we're looking to really build on together is thinking about how we can build our capacity. So through the DRCF, one of the areas we're looking at is how we ensure that we build skills, capability, and understanding. And in the area of AI in particular, that's something that we're keen to focus on. So we're looking to work together, and we're building out that capacity, thinking also about identifying some areas that may be of joint concern, and then thinking about how do we go about identifying and working through some of the key areas of risks that we've jointly identified. So just to give you a couple of examples of how that's working in practice, we are in the DRCF, we are working together with the Alan Turing Institute and with the Office for AI, and we're looking at researching different approaches to sharing skills with that group. So that's an important part of the work. I should also mention that we are using the regulators working group, which was founded by the ICO and which covers nearly all of the UK regulators. So we're using that to help push forward the discussion about the future of regulation in AI. So that's another example of how together we can work to both build our capacity, but also to try and think about the common areas and issues that we need to think about together.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. It's such an interesting topic, and it's not going to go away soon. And again, on a sort of similar work stream, you know, algorithms are impacting our lives in so many ways, from Netflix deciding what we should watch to, you know, what exam grades, you know, our GCSE and A-level students should get. And it's just central to so many digital services and markets. And it'd be interesting, and I'm going to put this to Will, you know, how is the forum approaching these issues and concern presented by algorithms?
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. I mean, as you say, algorithms are increasingly central to lots of things in our daily lives, our products, our services, even if we may not realise that. So, we've now for some years recognised that we really have to have the skills in-house within each of our individual regulators to understand these technologies. And there is sadly a lot of asymmetry between the numbers and the numbers of people and the skill sets available in some of these big firms compared to some of these public authorities. And the lack of transparency in all of this can lead to harm to consumers, whether that's through competition or through other ways. And actually, it can just make it very hard for us to check whether what firms are doing to solve problems is actually working. So the problem of fake reviews online is something that we've wrestled with for a long time, where it's really hard to work out what's going on behind the scenes. But again, as with lots of other areas, we're trying to work together increasingly hard to work out what might be needed to tackle this problem. What exact form of transparency might be needed, to what extent we need to be able to dig into these algorithms, and how we might do that. So we're building our own work on algorithms in our different fields, and building up our teams of data scientists, data engineers, but then also one of the work programs as part of the DRCF, which Kate mentioned at the beginning, was a program on algorithms, so that our respective teams of data engineers are all talking to one another, sharing experience and sharing expertise, hopefully, as with all of this, trying to be more than the sum of our parts.
That's good. And just on that, in terms of some of the parts, you've got 4 members of the forum, 4 really well respected and well known organisations, including the world famous FCA. Is this it? Is this the shape of it, or will there be more parts of government, or more other regulators involved in the forum? Yeah.
Shall I have a go at that? Because I'm talking. Well, look, never say never. What we've tried to start off with what we think is a sensible size of the forum, where there are few enough of us to be able to organise effectively and coordinate and cooperate, but also big enough to cover a meaningful set of areas. And I think these are the organisations for whom digital markets and some of the coming digital regulation changes are really at the heart of what we're going to be doing in the next few years. Yeah. Clearly, any regulator anywhere doing almost anything will have to encounter digital technologies in some form. So there are lots of ways in which we'll be talking to other regulators, indeed other fora out there, meetings that we're having, indeed with some other parallel regulators in the coming couple of weeks. So right now the DRCF is the 4 of us. Certainly not to say it would only ever be the 4 of us, but that's what we feel is the right shape for now.
Just to add to that very briefly, so I think that the emphasis for us now, as Will says, is just to get on and deliver what we set out we want to do. We are meeting regularly, probably quarterly going forward, with a much larger set of regulators who have interest in particular bits of some of the issues that we're dealing with, and we're just getting those set up. Also, obviously, critical is, as we think about how we engage internationally, which I mentioned, and of course, as I say, each of us, Ofcom has, networks of relevant communications regulators, but it's been really interesting to think about how does the DRCF work as you kind of look more internationally, and what can we share with international colleagues? As some have already mentioned in the chat, other areas are trying similar things, so what can we learn from each other? That's a really important part of the work for us.
And just on that, Kate, or anybody who wants to pick it up, how are you cooperating at the moment with your international peers, and particularly post Brexit, working out who's doing what, who you need to talk to across Europe, which was probably a bit more stable just a year or two back. So what's the plan to work wider across the world, and as we know, many of the important tech firms that will be included in these discussions are obviously based outside of the UK. So what's the plan for international cooperation?
I mean, I'll speak briefly, but then others probably want to come in. So, as you say, a lot of the firms we're dealing with are global, and so as we think about, you know, in Ofcom, as we think about the video sharing platform regime, or as we think about the online safety regime, really how we think about international engagement is absolutely key to the success of that work. What we've then been doing in the DRCF is thinking about, okay, so we each have those programs and networks, and yes, of course, recent events mean we have to kind of rethink about exactly what we're doing and how we're doing it, but we're still engaging, you know, if anything, because of the challenges we're facing, stronger than ever internationally, and working with international colleagues. The question for the DRCF then is, okay, well, what does this particular, you know, cross-section of regulators mean internationally? You know, and we're already starting to engage other countries. I went to a very interesting seminar not so long ago, presenting to other European colleagues and hearing about different models that other people were trying. And I think at the moment we're kind of in that space of sort of learning lessons from each other. And, you know, it works more or less well because, you know, different countries globally have a slightly different setup when it comes to their regulators. So some things translate very well, some things less so, and really sharing and trying to figure out what best practice might look like. But I'm sure other colleagues might want to come in as well.
So just to add, and thanks, Kate. I mean, I think you hinted at this already, Stuart, but I mean, what we're obviously seeing is this is a real first in history for national regulators around the world to be dealing with essentially the same set of companies and same set of services in all of our respective markets. And of course, the firms are global, but the regulators aren't. So I suspect it is. At the moment, it's probably quite specific to each regulator as to exactly how we engage. We all have our, you know, network of competition authorities around the world, or data protection authorities around the world, and so on, as Kate mentions. And for each of us, I think we're, you know, post-Brexit resetting our international frameworks. From our point of view, the government stated it's a priority to put together fresh cooperation agreements with our counterparts around the world, and indeed we've already done some of that ourselves, signing a rather snappily named thing called the Multilateral Mutual Assistance and Cooperation Agreement back last autumn with essentially the other main Anglophone competition authorities. So just an example of the kinds of things that we're all increasingly needing to do to face up to these global issues together. And actually, it's a particularly good year this year for this kind of cooperation because the UK has the G7 presidency, and I know that the I think I'm right in saying that the G7 data protection authorities have been talking, but we are also among competition authorities. There's a specific digital markets and competition track to the G7 presidency, so that's been a great sort of platform to have some of these international conversations.
I think I might cheekily add, and I suppose with an even more bullish tone, I think what we're doing here is attracting really serious interest from across the world. And I might just sort of expand on the reference Will made to the G7 data protection authorities, for example, where one of the other jurisdictions tabled on the agenda the intersection of competition and privacy, and how can you make these regimes work together. And actually, you've seen emerge from that conversation a collective commitment across the privacy regulators to try and work with their competition counterparts across the globe and to make sure that they are joining those things up. And I'll allow us to be smug very briefly, because we can say actually in the UK we've got that working. We've set out our joint statement on how we're working together in this area, which has attracted really super interest from people around the world, and we're translating into practical cooperation in areas like the CMA's sort of scrutiny of the Google Privacy Sandbox, where we're working really closely together. So I won't say we've got it mastered, but I think that actually what is happening in the UK is really exciting, and it's attracting a lot of interest. We got a lot of queries from our international partners around this.
That's great, and we were lucky enough to host a G7 meeting on data localization last week during the festival, so it was interesting to see the work that they're doing across, you know, international colleagues. Well, we're coming up to time now, so I'm just going to do, you know, time-honored fashion. One last quick-fire question, 30 seconds each, round the table, and just really quickly, you know, what's the one thing, what's project, work stream that you think is the most important to work on over the next sort of 2 to 3 years? And so I'm going to whiz round in the screen that I can see. So Kate Collier, yeah, I'll let you go first. You know, what's important to you and the FCA?
Thank you. Well, I mean, it's a bit of a cop-out to say it's all really important to us at the FCA, but it is, all of it, important. So each of the individual work streams that we're involved in, but also the engagement. I think the opportunity to get together and engage and build skills together is the key focus for us at the FCA.
Yeah, that's great. Will, do you want to go next? Oh, you're on mute, Will. Also
a pound in the mute jar. In an attempt to be give a different answer and hopefully be more interesting as a result, I'd probably say the skills and capabilities element of the work. We all know we're tooling up individually, and as I said earlier on this, as much as anything else, we need to be more than the sum of our parts and help each other do that work of tooling up to meet these new challenges.
That's great, thank you. And Stephen?
This is terrible. It's like asking us to pick from our children.
Yeah.
So, but I will say one of the things that I think has the most exciting sort of long-term promise here is actually the work that is being kicked off around how we horizon scan together, because actually what that is going to do is shift some of the conversation from how do we join up kind of what we're doing already to actually, you know, where we've got kind of greenfield sites, new areas that we're all looking at, how do we actually look at those jointly together for the first time? And I think then we're going to start seeing some really interesting, exciting sort of build on to where we've got to so far.
That's great, thank you. And Kate, we'll finish off with yourself.
Yeah, clearly not going to say anything interesting at this point. I mean, I'd say two things. So one, for me, it's about really embedding in all 4 organisations, so that this kind of approach to collaboration on these issues is second nature. You know, we're getting there, but I think that's kind of a work in progress. The second thing, and this is slightly different to what everybody else has said, but is those projects where we can really show change for users and for industry. So those regimes that are, you know, about to either are being implemented or about to be implemented, that we can really show a joined up approach. So it feels like something is moving, something is changing here.
No, that's great. Well, thank you all for that. And so I'm just going to say thank you to the panel today. I think it's been a fascinating insight into the work that the 4 regulators do and how they're coming together. It's really interesting to see, you know, the work that's happened and your international cooperation. It seems we're sort of slightly ahead of the game in terms of that cooperation within the UK, which is great. And as we've said, you know, it's a worldwide industry, so that cooperation across borders is really key. You know, we're really pleased and proud to have hosted this during the Leeds Digital Festival. And it's just great that we've been able to host this for you. And I really thank you for all your time today and the people behind the scenes who have spent the time sort of putting this together and making sure everything works. So I'd just like to say once again, thank you, and hopefully we'll see you next year back at the Leeds Digital Festival. And you know, have a great day, have a great weekend, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.